In Millbrook Street, Mark's church, a corporate executive was about to face his greatest betrayal. What started as a reluctant return for his father's funeral took a shocking turn when he came face to face with his sister's inheritance announcement. Marcus Henderson wasn't your typical absent son. For 6 months, he had been secretly monitoring his aging father through hidden cameras, known for his methodical nature and growing suspicions. When Victoria claimed everything, Marcus realized he was holding evidence of systematic elder abuse. His surveillance footage would expose a devastating truth that would destroy his family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Henderson's rental car felt foreign against the familiar gravel of his childhood driveway. The black sedan, corporate efficiency wrapped in German engineering, seemed to mock the weathered clapboard house that had sheltered 3 generations of Hendersons. He sat behind the wheel for a moment longer than necessary, his hands still gripping the leather steering wheel, as if it might anchor him to the life he'd built in Chicago. The house looked smaller than his memories suggested, though Victoria had clearly been maintaining it. Fresh paint on the shutters, new gutters catching the afternoon light. His father's garden showed signs of recent attention, neat rows of late-season vegetables that Eleanor would never harvest. The sight of it hit harder than expected. Victoria's voice carried across the yard before he'd even stepped from the car. She emerged from the front door wearing a black dress that managed to be both appropriate for mourning and flattering in a way that suggested careful consideration. At 42, she still possessed the effortless grace that had made her homecoming queen 24 years ago. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a style that emphasized the delicate bone structure Marcus had always envied. Flight was delayed in Denver, Marcus said, reaching for his overnight bag. The lie came easily. He'd actually sat in the airport bar for an hour, nursing a bourbon and questioning whether he should have come at all. Victoria's embrace felt performative, the kind of gesture meant to be observed. Over her shoulder, Marcus noticed Rebecca Martinez tending to something in her kitchen window next door. Mrs. Martinez had been watching the Henderson family's dramas for 30 years. Some things never changed. "Dad's in the front parlor," Victoria said, stepping back to study his face. "The viewing starts at 4. I wasn't sure you'd make it in time." The unspoken accusation hung between them. "You're always late. You're always somewhere else when it matters." Inside, the house carried the scent of his childhood. Lemon oil, old wood, and something indefinably masculine that had been their father's presence. Eleanor Henderson lay in the casket Victoria had chosen, wearing his best suit and looking peaceful in a way that seemed foreign to Marcus. His father had been a man of constant motion, always tinkering with something at the hardware store or puttering in his workshop. This stillness felt like a betrayal of everything Eleanor had been. "He looks good," Marcus said, because it seemed expected. "Mr. Gallagher did excellent work." Victoria's voice carried the authority of someone who'd handled all the arrangements. "Dad specifically requested the maple casket. He always said oak was too showy." Marcus nodded, though he couldn't remember their father expressing any opinion about caskets. Victoria had always possessed an unsettling ability to speak for others, to present her interpretations as established fact. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors, neighbors, customers from the hardware store, members of St. Mark's Episcopal, where Eleanor had served on the vestry for 15 years. Marcus found himself in the awkward position of receiving condolences from people who barely recognized him. Mrs. Chen from the Chinese restaurant squinted at him with obvious confusion before Victoria stepped in with helpful identifications. "You remember Marcus, don't you, Mrs. Chen? Eleanor's youngest? He lives in Chicago now." The way Victoria said Chicago made it sound like another planet, which, Marcus reflected, might not be entirely inaccurate. The last time he'd spent more than a weekend in Millbrook was Thomas's 8th birthday party 4 years ago. Even then, he'd taken calls from his office, his attention divided between family obligations and quarterly projections. "Successful businessman," Victoria continued, her tone carrying just enough pride to mask the underlying resentment. "Corporate consulting. Very important work." Mrs. Chen nodded politely and moved on, leaving Marcus to wonder if the description sounded as hollow to others as it did to him. The funeral service at St. Mark's revealed the full extent of his estrangement. Marcus sat in the front pew beside Victoria and Thomas, but he felt like an intruder at his own father's memorial. Reverend Williams spoke about Eleanor's dedication to community, his 40 years operating Henderson hardware, his devotion to family. The stories were all accurate, but they felt like descriptions of a stranger. When had Marcus last heard about his father's volunteer work at the food bank? When had they last discussed anything beyond weather and Marcus's reluctance to visit? Victoria delivered the eulogy with the poise of someone accustomed to public speaking. She painted a picture of Eleanor Henderson as a man who valued presence over presence, who understood that love was measured in time spent rather than money sent. Her voice cracked at just the right moments, and Marcus found himself wondering if the emotion was genuine or calculated. With Victoria, it was impossible to tell. Dad always said that family was the only thing that truly mattered, she concluded, her eyes finding Marcus in the congregation. That no amount of success could replace the bonds we share with those who knew us before we became who we thought we wanted to be. The words landed like physical blows. Marcus maintained his composure, but inside he felt something vital beginning to crack. The reception at the church hall proceeded with the familiar rhythm of small-town grief. Casseroles appeared as if by magic. Coffee percolated in industrial quantities, and conversations moved in comfortable patterns between memories of Eleanor and updates on local developments. Marcus found himself relegated to the edges, watching Victoria navigate the social dynamics with the skill of a born politician. "She's been a godsend," he overheard Mrs. Patterson telling Rebecca Martinez. "I don't know what Eleanor would have done without her these last few years. Some children abandon their parents, but Victoria never forgot her duty." Marcus excused himself to the parking lot, needing air that didn't carry the weight of unspoken judgments. Thomas found him there, smoking a cigarette he'd bummed from one of the funeral home attendants, a habit he'd abandoned years ago that seemed appropriate for the day's retrograde pull. "Uncle Marcus?" Thomas's voice carried the uncertainty of 16-year-old boys everywhere. "Are you okay?" At 17, Thomas possessed Victoria's fine features, but with Eleanor's steadier temperament. He'd grown tall since Marcus had last seen him, stretching into the kind of young man who might actually finish high school, unlike his mother. "Just needed some air," Marcus said, stubbing out the cigarette. "How are you holding up?" "It's weird, Grandpa being gone. The house feels different already." Marcus studied his nephew's face, seeing grief there but also something else, an anxiety that seemed deeper than normal mourning. Thomas had lived with Eleanor since Victoria's divorce 3 years ago, when the boy needed stability more than his mother could provide. The loss of his grandfather meant more than grief. It meant uncertainty about everything that would follow. They were interrupted by Victoria's voice calling from the church steps. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment?" The crowd gathered with the eager anticipation that small towns reserve for unexpected announcements. Victoria stood on the steps, backlit by the late afternoon sun, looking every inch the grieving daughter about to share something important. "I wanted to thank everyone for being here today. Dad would have been so moved by this turnout. He always said that Millbrook was blessed with the finest people in the world." Her voice carried clearly across the parking lot. "I also wanted to share something that Dad left for us, for our family and for this community he loved so much." Victoria reached into her purse and withdrew a folded document. "Yesterday, while going through Dad's papers, I found this, a will he'd prepared just last month. I had no idea he'd made these changes, but they reflect his deepest wishes for his legacy." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. His father had been methodical about legal matters, the kind of man who kept important documents in a filing cabinet labeled with his precise block lettering. The idea that Eleanor would have prepared a new will without mentioning it, without involving the family lawyer who'd handled Henderson affairs for 20 years, struck him as fundamentally wrong. Dad has left the house, the store, and his savings to ensure that the family legacy continues, in the hands of someone who never left, who never forgot that love means being present when it matters most. The meaning became clear even before Victoria spoke the words. Marcus watched his sister's performance with growing comprehension. The timing, the public setting, the way she'd positioned herself as the devoted daughter while casting him as the absent son. "Everything goes to me," Victoria concluded, her voice carrying just the right note of surprised humility. "I'm honored by Dad's trust, and I promise to use this gift to keep our family's roots strong in the community that shaped us all." The crowd murmured approval, but Marcus barely heard them. His mind was calculating timelines, remembering his father's voice during their last phone conversation 6 months ago. Eleanor had sounded confused, paranoid even, talking about people trying to take advantage of him. At the time, Marcus had attributed it to age and isolation. Now, standing in the church parking lot while his sister accepted congratulations on her inheritance of everything, those conversations took on a different meaning entirely. Thomas appeared at his elbow, his young face troubled. "Uncle Marcus? Did you know about this?" Marcus looked down at his nephew, seeing confusion and something that might have been fear in the boy's eyes. Thomas had lived in that house for 3 years. If Victoria inherited everything, what would happen to him? "No," Marcus said quietly, his gaze fixed on his sister as she graciously accepted the community's validation of her good fortune. "I had no idea." But even as he spoke the words, another thought was forming. 6 months ago, during his last visit to Millbrook, Marcus had noticed his father's increasing paranoia and confusion. Worried about Eleanor's vulnerability and Victoria's growing influence over their father's daily life, he'd made a decision that had seemed prudent at the time but now felt prophetic. He'd installed hidden cameras throughout the house. The crowd began to disperse, but Marcus remained in the parking lot, watching Victoria bask in her moment of triumph. His sister had always been skilled at reading situations, at positioning herself for maximum advantage. But this felt different, too convenient, too perfectly timed. As the last of the mourners departed, and the afternoon shadows lengthened across St. Mark's parking lot, Marcus found himself wondering what those cameras might have recorded during the past 6 months, and whether he was prepared for what he might discover. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he inserted the key into his childhood bedroom door. The brass knob turned with the same stubborn resistance he remembered from adolescence, when this room had been his refuge from family expectations and small-town suffocation. Now at 38, he found himself seeking that same sanctuary, though the stakes felt infinitely higher. The room remained largely unchanged, Victoria's tribute to preservation, or perhaps her way of maintaining the fiction that he might someday return permanently. His high school trophies still lined the bookshelf, academic achievements that had once made Eleanor beam with pride. A University of Chicago pennant hung above the desk where he'd written his college application essays, dreaming of escape to a world where intelligence mattered more than presence. His laptop bag felt heavy as he set it on the narrow bed. Outside, Millbrook settled into its evening rhythm, porch lights flickering on, the distant sound of the high school football team practicing under Friday night lights. It was the kind of peaceful tableau that had once made him feel trapped. Tonight, it felt ominous. Marcus opened his laptop and stared at the desktop for a long moment. The folder labeled Home Security sat innocuously among his work files, its contents representing a decision that had seemed rational 6 months ago, but now felt like betrayal. He'd installed those cameras out of genuine concern, not suspicion. The distinction mattered to him, even if it wouldn't matter to anyone else. His mind drifted back to that final visit in March. The official reason had been Eleanor's 75th birthday. But Marcus had really come because of their increasingly troubling phone conversations. His father, once sharp as the tools he sold at Henderson Hardware, had begun expressing paranoia about neighbors, confusion about dates, and a growing dependence on Victoria that set off quiet alarms in Marcus's analytical mind. "They're all trying to get something from me," Eleanor had said during one late-night call, his voice carrying an unfamiliar tremor. "Everyone wants a piece of what your mother and I built. Everyone except Victoria. She's the only one I can trust." The words had stuck with Marcus through sleepless nights in his Lincoln Park apartment. Eleanor Henderson had been many things. Stubborn, traditional, occasionally harsh in his judgments, but paranoid had never been among them. The man who'd negotiated fair deals with suppliers for 4 decades, didn't suddenly become suspicious of everyone around him without cause. That March visit had confirmed Marcus's worst fears. Eleanor moved differently, spoke differently, seemed diminished in ways that went beyond normal aging. And Victoria. Victoria had been everywhere, monitoring their father's medications, screening his phone calls, gently redirecting conversations when Eleanor seemed confused. At the time, Marcus had felt grateful for his sister's dedication. Only later, lying awake in his hotel room, had he begun to question the totality of her control. The cameras had been a compromise with his own conscience. If something was wrong, he needed evidence. If nothing was wrong, the footage would remain unwatched, a digital insurance policy against his own suspicions. He'd installed them carefully during Victoria's brief absence for Thomas's parent-teacher conference, one in the living room behind a picture frame, another in the kitchen near the coffee maker, a third in Eleanor's bedroom disguised as part of the clock radio, small, sophisticated devices purchased with corporate consulting money that felt dirty the moment he'd hidden them. Now, sitting in his childhood bedroom with Victoria's announcement echoing in his memory, Marcus knew the time for moral equivocation had passed. He clicked on the folder. The interface was clean, professional motion-activated recording stored in the cloud, accessible from anywhere with an internet connection. 6 months of his father's private life, compressed into digital files that Marcus had hoped never to review. The earliest entries showed Eleanor functioning normally, if slowly. He moved through the house with purpose, spoke clearly when Victoria or Thomas were present, maintained the routines that had defined his adult life. But as Marcus advanced through the timeline, patterns began to emerge that made his stomach clench with recognition. Victoria's visits became more frequent, her stays longer. Eleanor's independence gradually eroded as she began asking permission for simple tasks: making coffee, answering the phone, leaving the house. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible in isolation, but viewed in sequence, they revealed a systematic erosion of an old man's autonomy. The March entries showed a different Eleanor entirely. Confused, dependent, increasingly isolated from anyone except Victoria and Thomas. Marcus watched his father struggle to remember simple tasks, while Victoria provided helpful guidance that somehow made Eleanor more dependent rather than more capable. She brought his medications at precise times, prepared his meals, answered his phone with explanations that the caller had the wrong number or that Eleanor was resting. One particular recording made Marcus pause the playback. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table looking lost and frail in a way that broke something inside his chest. Victoria stood behind him, her hands on their father's shoulders in what appeared to be a comforting gesture. "Dad, we need to talk about your will again." Victoria's voice carried the patient tone reserved for children and invalids. "Remember what we discussed? Marcus hasn't been here for you. He sends money, but money isn't love. Money isn't presence when you need help in the middle of the night." Eleanor nodded slowly, his eyes unfocused. "Marcus is busy with his important work." "That's right. And that's fine. People make their choices. But your will should reflect reality, shouldn't it? It should go to the person who's actually been taking care of you, who sacrificed her own life to make sure you're safe and comfortable." Marcus felt sick. Victoria's words carried the surface appearance of logic, but underneath lay a calculated manipulation that transformed Eleanor's legitimate hurt about his absence into justification for disinheritance. She wasn't lying, exactly. Marcus had been absent, had prioritized his career over family obligations, had sent money rather than investing time. But Victoria was weaponizing those truths, using Eleanor's emotional vulnerability to serve her own purposes. The later recordings showed Eleanor becoming increasingly confused, sometimes not recognizing familiar objects or forgetting the names of lifelong friends. Victoria's response wasn't to seek medical help or family support, but to increase her control. She screened visitors with explanations that Eleanor was having a bad day, redirected phone calls, and gradually isolated their father from anyone who might question the changes in his behavior or circumstances. The final recordings, from just weeks before Eleanor's death, showed a man Marcus barely recognized. Frail, confused, entirely dependent on Victoria for basic needs. In one particularly damning sequence, Victoria sat beside Eleanor at the kitchen table with legal documents spread between them. "Just sign here, Dad. We talked about this, remember? You want to make sure I can take care of everything when you're gone. You don't want Marcus to have to deal with complicated legal issues when he's busy with his important work in Chicago." Eleanor's signature was shaky, uncertain. He looked up at Victoria with the trust of a child. "This is what we discussed?" "Exactly what we discussed. You're being very wise, thinking ahead like this." Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Marcus closed the laptop with more force than necessary. The room suddenly felt claustrophobic, filled with the weight of what he'd discovered. His sister hadn't just inherited their father's estate. She'd systematically manipulated a vulnerable old man into changing his will while isolating him from anyone who might have intervened. But Marcus had intervened, in his own way. Those cameras represented his attempt to protect Eleanor from exactly what had happened. The irony wasn't lost on him. His absence had created the circumstances that allowed Victoria's manipulation, but his guilty conscience had provided the evidence to expose it. The question now was what to do with that evidence. Using it would destroy Victoria, potentially send her to prison, and shatter what remained of their family. Thomas would lose not just his grandfather, but potentially his mother as well. The Henderson name, respected in Millbrook for 3 generations, would become synonymous with elder abuse and family betrayal. But doing nothing meant allowing Victoria's manipulation to stand, letting Eleanor's true wishes be buried along with his body. It meant accepting that desperate circumstances justified any behavior, that need excused betrayal. Marcus stared at his reflection in the dark window, seeing his father's stubborn jawline and his mother's thoughtful eyes. Eleanor Henderson had been many things, but he'd always been fair. His original will, the one Victoria claimed didn't exist, had split the estate between his children, because that reflected his actual values, not the desperate gratitude Victoria had cultivated during his final, vulnerable months. The house creaked around him, old wood settling into night patterns that had once been comforting. Now every sound seemed significant, pregnant with secrets and surveillance. Somewhere in the walls, his cameras continued recording, capturing whatever private moments Victoria might be having as she celebrated her inheritance. Marcus opened the laptop again and began copying files to an encrypted drive. Whatever he decided to do, he needed those recordings preserved and protected. Evidence had a way of disappearing, especially when it threatened to destroy carefully constructed narratives. As he worked, transferring months of his father's final degradation into portable storage, Marcus felt the last of his illusions about family loyalty dissolving. Victoria's announcement at the funeral hadn't been the spontaneous sharing of surprising news. It had been the culmination of a months-long campaign to isolate and manipulate a vulnerable old man. The worst part was that some of Victoria's accusations were true. Marcus had been absent when Eleanor needed him most. He'd prioritized career advancement over family responsibility, sent money instead of investing time, built a successful life that required him to abandon the people who'd shaped him. His guilt about those failures had made him vulnerable to Victoria's manipulation as well, though at a distance that had ultimately protected him. Now, with damning evidence of his sister's systematic abuse stored on an encrypted drive, Marcus faced a choice that would define not just his own future, but the future of everyone connected to the Henderson name. Justice demanded exposure. Family loyalty demanded silence. His father's true wishes demanded action. Outside his window, Millbrook continued its peaceful evening routine, unaware that one of its most respected families was about to implode. Marcus closed the laptop and lay back on his childhood bed, staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars still marked constellations he'd learned 30 years ago. The stars had seemed so important then, pointing toward futures filled with possibility and escape. Now they just reminded him how far he'd traveled from home, and how impossible it might be to find his way back to anything resembling family or peace. The decision he made in the next few days would echo through Thomas's life, through Victoria's future, through the community that had shaped them all. Marcus had spent his career analyzing complex problems and recommending decisive action. But those had been other people's problems. Other people's families. This was his father's legacy, his sister's freedom, his nephew's security, and his own conscience, all balanced on the edge of a choice he wasn't sure he was brave enough to make. Marcus's coffee had grown cold by the time he reached Margaret Frost's law office on Main Street. The brick building had housed Frost and Associates for 40 years, its brass nameplate weathered but dignified, much like Margaret herself. At 63, she possessed the kind of professional authority that came from decades of handling Millbrook's most sensitive legal matters with discretion and competence. Her secretary, a woman Marcus vaguely remembered from high school, showed him into the familiar office where his parents had signed their first wills 20 years ago. The room smelled of leather-bound law books and the faint vanilla scent Margaret had always favored. Family photos lined her desk. Grandchildren Marcus had never met, a husband who'd passed 5 years earlier, a life built on the foundation of trust and community service. Marcus. Margaret rose from behind her mahogany desk, extending a hand that carried the firm grip of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "I'm so sorry about your father." Eleanor was a good man, one of the finest I've had the privilege to know. The words carried weight because Margaret didn't offer empty condolences. Her assessment of character mattered in Millbrook, where reputation was currency and her opinion could make or break business deals. "Thank you," Marcus said, settling into the leather chair across from her desk. "I appreciate you seeing me on such short notice." Margaret studied his face with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 4 decades reading clients' intentions. "Victoria mentioned you might have questions about the estate. I have to say, I was surprised by yesterday's announcement. Your father never mentioned preparing a new will." The statement hung between them, neither quite an accusation nor an invitation, but something that demanded careful navigation. Marcus had rehearsed this conversation during his sleepless night, but sitting across from Margaret, who'd known him since he was Thomas's age, the practiced words felt inadequate. "That's actually why I'm here," Marcus said carefully. "The timing seems unusual. Dad never mentioned changing his will during our phone conversations, and he was usually meticulous about discussing legal matters." Margaret nodded slowly. Eleanor was indeed methodical about such things. "The original will, the one I prepared in 2019, split the estate evenly between you and Victoria, with provisions for Thomas's education. Your father was very specific about wanting to be fair to both his children, regardless of who stayed closer to home." The confirmation of what Marcus had suspected hit harder than expected. His father's original intentions had been exactly what anyone who knew Eleanor would have predicted. Fair, measured, reflecting love rather than gratitude or proximity. "When was this new will supposedly prepared?" Marcus asked. "According to the document Victoria showed me, it was drafted last month by Hartwell and Associates in the county seat. I found that odd, frankly. Eleanor had used this firm for every legal matter since 1985. I can't imagine why he would suddenly change attorneys without mentioning it." Margaret's professional discretion was evident, but her discomfort with the situation came through clearly. She'd built her reputation on understanding her clients' wishes and protecting their interests. The idea that Eleanor would have bypassed her for such an important matter clearly troubled her. Marcus made his decision. "Margaret, I need to show you something. But first, I need your word that this conversation is confidential, regardless of what I decide to do with the information." Her eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "Attorney-client privilege applies the moment you walked through that door, Marcus. What's troubling you?" Marcus opened his laptop and turned it toward her. 6 months ago, I became concerned about Dad's mental state. He was expressing paranoia, confusion about dates, growing dependence on Victoria that seemed excessive. I installed security cameras in the house to monitor the situation." Margaret's expression remained professionally neutral, but Marcus caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "That's a significant step. What did you discover?" "Systematic manipulation," Marcus said quietly. "Victoria gradually isolated Dad from outside contact, controlled his medications, managed his daily routines in ways that increased, rather than supported his independence. And she coached him into changing his will while he was in a highly vulnerable state. He selected a file from the folder, one of the clearer examples of Victoria's manipulation tactics." Margaret watched in silence as Victoria guided Eleanor through signing documents, her voice carrying the patient tone reserved for children, while her words systematically undermined his connection to Marcus. When the clip ended, Margaret sat back in her chair, her professional composure intact but her eyes troubled. "This is deeply concerning, Marcus. If authentic, this footage suggests elder abuse on multiple levels: financial, emotional, and psychological." "It's authentic," Marcus said. "I have 6 months of recordings showing the progression of Dad's decline and Victoria's increasing control over his environment and decisions." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers steepled as she processed the implications. "You understand what you're suggesting? This evidence could potentially invalidate the new will and result in criminal charges against Victoria for elder abuse, fraud, and undue influence." The weight of those words settled between them. Marcus had known intellectually that his evidence was damning, but hearing it confirmed by someone with Margaret's experience made the reality inescapable. "What are my legal options?" he asked. "Several," Margaret said, reaching for a legal pad. "You could contest the will in probate court, using this evidence to demonstrate that Eleanor lacked the mental capacity to make such decisions and was subject to undue influence. The original will would likely be reinstated." She paused, her pen hovering over the paper. "You could also file a complaint with Adult Protective Services, though Eleanor's death limits their ability to investigate. More significantly, you could present this evidence to law enforcement. What you've described constitutes criminal elder abuse under state law." Marcus felt his stomach clench. What would that mean for Victoria? If prosecuted successfully, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult is a felony. She could face significant prison time, especially given the systematic nature of the abuse and the substantial assets involved. The clinical language couldn't disguise the human reality. Marcus was contemplating actions that would destroy his sister's life, separate Thomas from his only remaining parent, and expose their family's dysfunction to public scrutiny. "There's another consideration," Margaret continued gently. "Thomas. If Victoria is prosecuted, who would assume custody? The boy is 16, old enough to have opinions about his situation, but still a minor requiring adult guardianship." Marcus hadn't fully considered this aspect. Thomas would become another casualty of the choice between justice and family loyalty. The boy had already lost his grandfather. Pursuing criminal charges could cost him his mother as well. "What would you do?" Marcus asked. Margaret smiled sadly. "I'm an attorney, not a family counselor. I can tell you about legal options and likely outcomes, but the moral dimensions of this decision are yours alone to navigate." She closed the legal pad and leaned forward. "I will say this. Your father trusted me to protect his interests and honor his wishes. The will I prepared reflected his genuine intentions when he possessed full mental capacity. What Victoria obtained from him during his decline doesn't represent Eleanor's true desires." Marcus closed the laptop, the weight of decision heavier than ever. "If I decide to contest the will, would you represent me?" "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "But Marcus, consider carefully whether you want to pursue this through civil or criminal channels. A probate contest would restore your father's original will and could be handled with relative discretion. Criminal charges would make everything public and irrevocable." She stood, signaling the end of their formal consultation. "Whatever you decide, decide quickly. Evidence can disappear. Witnesses can be influenced. And the longer Victoria has to consolidate her position, the more difficult it becomes to challenge her narrative." Marcus shook her hand, noting the firm grip that somehow conveyed both support and warning. As he left her office, stepping back onto Main Street, where his family's hardware store stood 3 blocks away, he carried the weight of professional confirmation that his worst suspicions were justified. Victoria hadn't just manipulated their father. She'd committed crimes that demanded justice. The question now was whether Marcus possessed the moral courage to pursue that justice, knowing it would destroy what remained of their family and leave Thomas caught in the wreckage of adult choices he'd had no part in making. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's quiet streets, and Marcus realized that whatever decision he made in the coming hours would determine not just the distribution of Eleanor's estate, but the very definition of family loyalty and justice in his own moral universe. Less than generated _ story greater than part 4, the neighbor's truth. The Martinez house sat like a sentinel next to the Henderson family home, its kitchen window offering an unobstructed view of the comings and goings that had defined Marcus's childhood. Rebecca Martinez had occupied that strategic position for 32 years, watching the Henderson children grow up, witnessing Eleanor's gradual transition from grieving widower to isolated old man, and observing Victoria's increasing presence during the final months of their father's life. Marcus found himself standing on Rebecca's front porch at 4 o'clock Saturday afternoon, his finger hovering over the doorbell as he wrestled with the weight of what he was about to ask. Rebecca had been more than a neighbor. She'd been the closest thing to an aunt that he and Victoria had known after their mother's death. Involving her in his suspicions about Victoria felt like another betrayal in a week already heavy with them. The door opened before he could ring the bell. Rebecca stood in the doorway wearing a flour-dusted apron, her silver hair pulled back in the practical style she'd maintained for as long as Marcus could remember. At 68, she remained vigorous, her dark eyes sharp, with the intelligence that had made her a formidable high school English teacher before retirement. Marcus. Her voice carried warmth, tinged with something that might have been relief. I saw you walking up the path. Come in, Mijo. I just put coffee on. The Martinez kitchen served as the emotional center of the house, its walls covered with 3 decades of family photographs, children's artwork, and the accumulated memories of a life lived in service to others. The familiar scent of cinnamon and fresh bread created an atmosphere of comfort that made Marcus's chest tight with childhood nostalgia. Rebecca gestured toward the breakfast nook where Marcus had eaten countless after-school snacks, where she'd helped him with homework when his parents were busy with the store, where she'd listened to teenage complaints about Millbrook's limitations with the patience of someone who understood that small-town life wasn't meant for everyone. You look tired, Rebecca said, pouring coffee into the same blue ceramic mugs she'd used for decades. This has been a difficult week for everyone. Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how Rebecca's movements carried a careful deliberation that hadn't been present during his last visit. She settled across from him, her hands wrapped around her mug in a gesture that suggested she needed its warmth despite the afternoon heat. Mrs. Martinez, Marcus began, then stopped. The formal address felt wrong in this kitchen, where she'd bandaged his scraped knees and celebrated his academic achievements. Rebecca, I need to ask you about Dad's final months. About Victoria's role in his care. Something shifted in Rebecca's expression, a subtle tightening that suggested Marcus had touched on a subject she'd been dreading. She took a careful sip of coffee before responding. Your father was lucky to have Victoria's dedication, she said, but the words carried a rehearsed quality that didn't match the wariness in her eyes. Marcus leaned forward slightly. I'm not questioning Victoria's dedication. I'm asking about what you observed during Dad's decline, about whether his increasing isolation seemed natural. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the window that had given her a front-row seat to the Henderson family's final act. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of months of suppressed concern. Your father changed, Marcus. Not just physically, that's natural at his age, but in ways that worried me. He became fearful, suspicious of people he'd known for decades. He stopped coming outside to tend his garden, stopped walking to the hardware store for his daily coffee with the regulars. She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. Victoria said he was having memory problems, that the confusion made him anxious around people. She was protecting him, keeping his world small and manageable. But you had doubts, Marcus said gently. Rebecca's composure cracked slightly. I should have done something. I should have called you, or contacted someone who could have. But Victoria was so convincing, so dedicated. Who was I to question a daughter's care for her father? The guilt in her voice was palpable. Marcus recognized it because he carried the same burden, the knowledge that they'd both sensed something wrong but failed to act on their instincts. Tell me what you saw, Marcus said. Not what Victoria told you was happening, but what you actually witnessed. Rebecca stood and moved to the window, her back to Marcus as she looked toward the Henderson house. The isolation happened gradually. First, Victoria started screening his phone calls, saying he got confused and upset when people called unexpectedly. Then she began limiting visitors, explaining that social interaction exhausted him. By winter, almost no one was seeing Eleanor except Victoria and Thomas. She turned back to Marcus, her expression troubled. I offered to help many times, bringing meals, sitting with him so Victoria could have a break, taking him to doctor's appointments. Victoria always had reasons why that wasn't necessary. She was handling everything, she said. Dad preferred familiar faces, she said. He got agitated around people who reminded him of how much he'd changed. Marcus felt his suspicions crystallizing into certainty. What about his mental state? Did you see signs of dementia or confusion when you did interact with him? That's what troubled me most, Rebecca admitted, returning to her seat. The few times I managed to speak with Eleanor alone, when Victoria was running errands or busy with Thomas, he seemed more like himself, slower, yes, and sometimes forgetful about recent events, but not the confused, frightened man Victoria described. She wrapped her hands around her mug again, seeking comfort in its warmth. There was one afternoon in February when Victoria's car wouldn't start, and she had to walk to the auto shop. I went over with some soup, and Eleanor invited me in for coffee. We talked for an hour, about the old days, about your mother, about how proud he was of your success in Chicago. His mind was clear, Marcus. He knew exactly who I was, remembered details about conversations we'd had months earlier. Marcus leaned forward, his pulse quickening. What did he say about the family situation? About Victoria's care? Rebecca's voice dropped to a whisper, as if Victoria might overhear despite being a house away. He said he worried about being a burden. He felt guilty that Victoria had sacrificed so much to take care of him, especially after her divorce. He mentioned wanting to make sure she was provided for, but he also... She paused, seeming to struggle with the memory. What did he say, Rebecca? He said he hoped you would understand that love doesn't always look the same for everyone. That Victoria's way of showing love was different from yours, but both mattered to him. He specifically mentioned wanting to be fair to both his children in his will, to recognize that you'd built your own life, but that didn't mean you loved him less. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. His father's actual thoughts, expressed during a moment of clarity, directly contradicted the narrative Victoria had constructed about Eleanor's disappointment in his absent son. When was this conversation? Marcus asked. February 15th. I remember because it was Valentine's Day weekend, and Eleanor mentioned missing your mother, especially during holidays. When Victoria returned that evening, she seemed upset that I'd visited. She said the interaction had tired Eleanor out, that he'd been confused and agitated after I left. Marcus closed his eyes, processing the implications. Victoria hadn't just manipulated their father during his vulnerable moments. She'd actively worked to discredit anyone who might have witnessed his clearer thinking or contradicted her narrative about his mental state. Did you see anything else that concerned you? Marcus asked. Rebecca nodded reluctantly. The medications. Victoria managed all of Eleanor's prescriptions, but I sometimes wondered if the dosages were appropriate. He seemed increasingly drowsy and confused after she started giving him evening pills for anxiety. When I asked about them, she said the doctor had prescribed them to help him sleep better. She paused, her expression growing more troubled. I'm not a medical professional, Marcus, but I've seen enough elderly friends struggle with over-medication. Eleanor's decline seemed too rapid, too complete. Within months, he went from a man who could still drive and manage his own affairs to someone who couldn't be trusted to answer the phone. Marcus felt pieces of a disturbing puzzle falling into place. Victoria's control hadn't been limited to emotional manipulation. She'd potentially used medication to keep their father compliant and confused, making him more susceptible to her influence while creating the appearance of rapid cognitive decline. Why didn't you call me? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. Because I wasn't certain. Because Victoria seemed so devoted, so caring. Because interfering in family matters felt wrong, especially when I had no proof of anything except my own unease. She wiped her eyes with a paper napkin, her voice strengthening with resolution. And because Victoria was very clear that you were too busy with your important career to be bothered with day-to-day caregiving concerns. She said you sent money but weren't interested in the difficult reality of managing an aging parent's decline. The manipulation had been total, Marcus realized. Victoria had isolated their father not just from outside influences, but from Marcus himself by controlling the narrative about his absence and priorities. She'd positioned herself as the only person who truly cared, while making it seem inappropriate for others to interfere. I should have called you anyway, Rebecca continued. I should have trusted my instincts instead of Victoria's explanations. Your father deserved better protection than my polite silence. Marcus reached across the table and covered her hand with his. You're not responsible for what happened. Victoria was skilled at manipulation. She fooled everyone, including me. But even as he offered comfort, Marcus felt the weight of shared guilt. Rebecca's observations confirmed what his surveillance footage had revealed, but they also highlighted how many people had sensed something wrong without acting on their concerns. Eleanor's vulnerability had been compounded by everyone's reluctance to challenge Victoria's authority as the devoted daughter. As he prepared to leave Rebecca's kitchen, Marcus carried with him not just confirmation of his suspicions, but also the knowledge that Victoria's manipulation had extended far beyond their father. She'd systematically constructed a narrative that made interference seem inappropriate, and concern seem like interference, isolating Eleanor while maintaining the appearance of devoted care. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Martinez backyard as Marcus walked toward his rental car, Rebecca's testimony adding crucial weight to the evidence he'd already gathered. His sister's crimes had been witnessed, her methods observed, her isolation tactics documented by someone with no agenda except the welfare of a man she'd cared about for 3 decades. Now Marcus faced the full scope of Victoria's deception, armed with evidence that could expose her crimes but would also devastate the community that had trusted her narrative of devoted daughterhood. The weight of that knowledge and the decision it demanded felt heavier than ever as he prepared to confront Victoria directly about what he'd discovered. Marcus found Victoria in their father's study, seated behind Eleanor's mahogany desk as if she'd already claimed ownership of every corner of the house. Legal documents were spread across the leather surface. Insurance papers, bank statements, deed transfers, the bureaucratic machinery of inheritance already in motion. Less than 24 hours after the funeral, she looked up as he entered, her expression shifting from casual confidence to wary attention. Marcus, I thought you'd left for Chicago already. We need to talk. He closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing with finality in the book-lined room where their father had balanced decades of hardware store ledgers. Victoria leaned back in Eleanor's chair, her posture radiating the composed authority she'd perfected over the past 6 months. If this is about the will, I understand you're surprised. Dad made his decision based on who was actually here when he needed help. Cut the performance, Victoria. Marcus's voice carried a hardness he rarely used. There's no audience here, just us. Something flickered in her eyes, uncertainty, perhaps fear. But her smile remained perfectly calibrated. I don't know what you mean. I'm just grateful Dad recognized my sacrifices. Marcus pulled out his phone and placed it on the desk between them. I installed cameras in this house 6 months ago. I have footage of everything. Your isolation tactics, the medication management, your coaching sessions for the will change. All of it. The color drained from Victoria's face, but she recovered quickly. You were spying on your own father? That's sick, Marcus. Even for you. Dad was paranoid and confused during our phone calls. I was worried about his safety. Marcus kept his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. I never imagined I'd discover his own daughter systematically destroying his independence and manipulating him into disinheriting his son. Victoria stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. You have no idea what I sacrificed. While you built your perfect life in Chicago, I stayed here changing Dad's diapers and listening to him ask for Mom 50 times a day. Victoria's hand shook as she fumbled with her phone, scrolling through contacts with the frantic energy of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. Marcus had left the study 20 minutes ago, his final words echoing in her mind like a death sentence. "You have until tomorrow morning to figure out how you want to handle this." The house felt different now. No longer her sanctuary, but a crime scene. Every room potentially harboring evidence of her manipulation. She moved through the familiar spaces with paranoid urgency, searching for the cameras Marcus claimed to have installed. The living room picture frames revealed nothing obvious. The kitchen appliances appeared normal. But she knew he was methodical, patient in ways that had always intimidated her. Her first call went to James, her ex-husband. Despite their bitter divorce, he understood her methods better than anyone, perhaps the only person who might help her navigate this crisis without judgment. "Victoria?" James's voice carried surprise, tinged with wariness. "It's been months since. I need your help." She cut straight to the point, her usual manipulation tactics abandoned in favor of desperate honesty. "Marcus has surveillance footage of Dad's final months. He's going to use it to contest the will." A long pause. "What kind of footage?" Victoria closed her eyes, knowing that admitting the truth to James meant acknowledging what she'd become. Everything. The medication adjustments, the isolation, the will coaching. All of it. "Jesus, Victoria." James's voice carried a mixture of disgust and recognition. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough to send me to prison." She sank onto the living room couch, the weight of her situation finally crushing her careful composure. "I need to know, legally, what are my options?" James was quiet for a moment. Despite their animosity, he possessed the practical intelligence that had once attracted her to him. "Can you access the cameras? Destroy the evidence? I don't know where they are. Marcus is too smart to make them obvious." Victoria stood and began pacing, her mind racing through possibilities. Maybe I can discredit the footage somehow. Claim it was edited, or taken out of context. With what proof? "Victoria, you're talking about elder abuse charges. If that footage shows what you've described, no jury is going to care about your justifications." The brutal honesty hit her like cold water. James had seen her manipulate their son during custody battles, had witnessed her ability to twist truth until it served her purposes. But this was different, criminal rather than civil, with consequences that extended far beyond family court. "What about Thomas?" she asked, playing her strongest card. "If they prosecute me, what happens to him?" "He's 16, old enough for the court to consider his preferences, but still needing adult guardianship." James's voice softened slightly. "Is that really what you want to use him for? Making him choose between his mother and his grandfather's justice?" Victoria felt something cold settle in her chest. Using Thomas as emotional leverage had been instinctive, but hearing it articulated so bluntly made her recognize how far she'd fallen from the woman who'd once put her son's welfare above everything else. After ending the call, Victoria moved to Eleanor's bedroom, the space where she'd spent countless hours during his final months, the intimate setting where she'd gradually assumed control over every aspect of his daily life. She began searching systematically, behind the alarm clock, inside picture frames, around the television. Marcus's cameras could be anywhere, continuing to record her desperate attempts to find them. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Martinez. "Victoria, dear, I have some of your father's mail. Could you stop by when convenient?" The innocent message felt ominous. Rebecca had been growing more distant during Eleanor's final months. Her offers to help increasingly politely declined. Had the old woman suspected something? Had Marcus already spoken with her? Victoria's next call went to Dr. Patterson, Eleanor's primary care physician. If she could establish that the medication changes had been medically necessary, perhaps she could cast doubt on Marcus's interpretation of the footage. "Dr. Patterson, this is Victoria Henderson. I wanted to thank you again for your care during Dad's final months, and to ask about the prescriptions you recommended for his anxiety and confusion." A pause that felt loaded with significance. "Victoria, I need to be honest with you. Several of the medications your father was taking in his final months weren't prescribed by this office. When I reviewed his chart after his passing, I noticed discrepancies between what I'd recommended and what he was apparently taking." Victoria's stomach dropped. "I don't understand. I only gave him what you prescribed." I'm sure there was some confusion, Dr. Patterson said diplomatically. Perhaps medications from specialists, or over-the-counter supplements that interacted poorly with his prescriptions. It's more common than you might think in elderly patients with multiple caregivers. But Victoria could hear the doubt in his voice. Doctor. Patterson had noticed the same rapid decline that had troubled Rebecca Martinez. The medical professional's careful language couldn't disguise his suspicion that something had been wrong with Eleanor's care. As evening approached, Victoria found herself in her father's workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had defined his later years. Half-finished birdhouses lined the workbench, evidence of a mind that had remained capable of complex tasks even during his supposed decline. The sight of them made her chest tight with something that might have been regret. Her phone rang. Thomas. Mom? Uncle Marcus wants to talk to me. He says it's important. About Grandpa's will. Should I meet with him? Victoria closed her eyes, recognizing the moment when her choices would either protect or destroy her son's remaining innocence. Thomas loved his grandfather, trusted his mother, and had no understanding of the adult machinations that had defined Eleanor's final months. What did you tell him? She asked. That I needed to check with you first. Mom, Uncle Marcus seemed really upset. Like angry upset, not just sad about Grandpa. Is everything okay? Victoria stood among her father's tools, holding her phone with trembling hands, and realized that nothing would ever be okay again. Marcus's evidence would expose her crimes, destroy her freedom, and leave Thomas to navigate the wreckage of adult choices he'd played no role in making. But using her son as a shield, manipulating his love and loyalty to protect herself from the consequences of elder abuse, would complete her transformation from desperate daughter to someone she no longer recognized. Tell Uncle Marcus you'll meet with him, she said quietly. But Thomas, whatever he tells you, remember that people sometimes do terrible things for reasons they believe are right, and that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. After ending the call, Victoria sat in Eleanor's workshop as darkness fell over Millbrook, surrounded by the unfinished projects of a man whose trust she'd betrayed in the name of love and desperation. Somewhere in the walls around her, Marcus's cameras continued recording, capturing her final hours of freedom before the weight of truth and justice crushed everything she'd built on the foundation of manipulation and fear. The tools that had shaped 3 generations of Henderson craftsmanship seemed to watch her with silent judgment, witnesses to the destruction of a family legacy that had taken decades to build and only months to destroy. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at the Henderson house at 9:30 Monday morning, her unmarked sedan joining the growing collection of official vehicles that would soon transform the quiet residential street into a crime scene. At 45, Chen carried herself with the practiced composure of someone who'd spent 15 years investigating the intersection of family dysfunction and criminal behavior. But something about Marcus Henderson's phone call had stayed with her through a restless night. Elder abuse cases possessed a particular kind of tragedy that distinguished them from other crimes. The victims were often isolated, vulnerable, and trusting of the very people who exploited them. The perpetrators were usually family members driven by desperation, greed, or a toxic combination of both. But the systematic nature of what Marcus had described, documented by months of surveillance footage, suggested something more calculated than typical family crisis. Marcus met her at the front door, his appearance reflecting the strain of the past few days. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually precise grooming showing signs of neglect, but his eyes carried the focused intensity of someone who'd made an irreversible decision. Detective Chen, thank you for coming so quickly. Mr. Henderson, I have to say, your allegations are serious. Elder abuse, financial exploitation, undue influence. These are felony charges that could result in significant prison time. Chen studied his face, looking for signs of family revenge disguised as justice. Are you certain you want to proceed with this complaint? Marcus nodded without hesitation. I've thought about nothing else for the past 3 days. My father deserved better protection than he received, and Victoria needs to be held accountable for what she did to him. Chen followed Marcus into the living room, where he'd set up his laptop and external monitors. The space felt heavy with recent grief, Eleanor's favorite chair still bore the impression of his body. Medical equipment remained stacked in corners, and prescription bottles cluttered the side tables. It was the environment of a man who'd been dependent on others for his most basic needs. "Before we review any evidence," Chen said, settling into a chair across from Marcus, "I need to understand the family dynamics. Your relationship with your father, your sister's role as caregiver, any previous conflicts over inheritance or care decisions." Marcus took a careful breath. "I left Millbrook at 18 for college and built a career in Chicago. I maintained contact with Dad through phone calls and financial support, but I wasn't physically present for day-to-day care. Victoria stayed local, divorced 3 years ago, and gradually assumed primary responsibility for Dad's needs as he aged. Any history of conflict between you and Victoria? Sibling rivalry, different life choices, some resentment about my absence during family crises, but nothing that would suggest she was capable of systematic manipulation." Marcus paused, his voice growing quieter. "I installed the surveillance cameras because I was genuinely worried about Dad's mental state and wanted to ensure he was safe. I never expected to discover evidence of abuse." Chen appreciated his honesty about the family tensions. Many complainants in elder abuse cases tried to portray themselves as perfect relatives wronged by obviously evil siblings. Marcus's acknowledgement of his own failures made his allegations more credible. "Show me what you found," she said. The footage was damning in ways that made Chen's stomach clench with professional recognition. She'd seen elder abuse before, but rarely documented so thoroughly or systematically. The progression was clear. Victoria gradually assuming control over Eleanor's environment, medications, and social contacts, while coaching him toward decisions that served her financial interests. "This segment shows Victoria managing Dad's phone calls," Marcus explained, pointing to a scene where Victoria intercepted the house phone and informed a caller that Eleanor was resting and couldn't speak. She screened almost all his contact with the outside world during his final months. Chen watched Victoria's performance with the clinical eye of someone trained to recognize manipulation tactics. The woman's behavior followed classic patterns of financial abuse: isolation, control, and the gradual erosion of the victim's autonomy disguised as caregiving. "And this shows the will coaching," Marcus continued, advancing to footage of Victoria guiding Eleanor through signing legal documents while he appeared confused and dependent. "Has the new will been probated yet?" Chen asked. Victoria filed it Friday. The attorney she used, not Dad's usual lawyer, seemed surprised by the rushed timeline, but everything appeared legally valid. Chen made notes on her tablet, already thinking about the investigation process. "I'll need copies of all this footage, medical records, financial documents, and contact information for anyone who interacted with your father during his final months. We'll also need to interview Victoria, though I suspect she'll request an attorney." As if summoned by their conversation, the front door opened and Victoria entered with Thomas beside her. Victoria's appearance was carefully controlled, appropriate grief mixed with weary dignity. But Chen noticed the tension in her movements, the way her eyes immediately swept the room, cataloging the official presence. "Marcus," Victoria said, her voice carrying hurt rather than anger. "I see you've made your decision." Thomas looked confused and frightened, his teenage face struggling to process the adult drama unfolding around him. "Uncle Marcus, Mom said you wanted to talk to the police about Grandpa. I don't understand what's happening." Chen stood, extending her badge toward Victoria. "Detective Sarah Chen, Millbrook Police. Mrs. Castellanos, I need to speak with you about your father's care during his final months." Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "I assume my brother has shared his conspiracy theories about my devoted care for our father." Marcus always preferred dramatic explanations to simple truths. "Ma'am, we have evidence suggesting systematic elder abuse, financial exploitation, and undue influence in the preparation of your father's final will. You're not under arrest at this time, but I strongly recommend you contact an attorney before we continue this conversation." The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Thomas stepped closer to his mother, his young face pale with growing comprehension. "Mom, what is she talking about?" Victoria's mask finally slipped, revealing the desperate woman beneath the careful performance. "Thomas, Your uncle has convinced himself that taking care of Grandpa was somehow a crime. He'd rather believe terrible things about me than accept that he abandoned his own father. Chen recognized the deflection tactic, attacking the complainant's motives rather than addressing the allegations. But Marcus had prepared for this response. Thomas, Marcus said gently, your mother gradually isolated your grandfather from outside contact, managed his medications in ways that increased his confusion, and coached him into changing his will while he was vulnerable and dependent. I have 6 months of surveillance footage documenting these actions. Thomas looked between the adults, his world crumbling as he processed the implications. Mom? Is that true? Victoria reached for her son, but Thomas stepped back instinctively. The teenager's instinctive retreat from his mother's touch seemed to break something fundamental in Victoria's composure. You have no idea what I sacrificed, Victoria said, her voice rising as the carefully maintained facade dissolved. While Marcus built his perfect life, I stayed here changing Dad's diapers, listening to him call for Mom in the middle of the night, watching him forget my name some days. I deserved that inheritance. I earned it through years of sacrifice that Marcus never bothered to acknowledge. Chen had heard similar justifications before, caregivers who convinced themselves that their sacrifices justified criminal behavior. But Victoria's confession, delivered in front of witnesses, would make the prosecution significantly easier. Mrs. Castellanos, Chen said formally, you're under arrest for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and undue influence. You have the right to remain silent. As Chen read Victoria her rights, Thomas stood frozen in the middle of his grandfather's living room, watching his mother's hands being cuffed behind her back. The teenager's shock and pain were palpable. In the space of minutes, he'd lost not just his mother but his understanding of everything that had defined his family relationships. Marcus moved toward his nephew, but Thomas shook his head, tears streaming down his young face. You did this. You called the police on Mom. You destroyed our family. The accusation hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. He'd known that seeking justice would have consequences, but seeing Thomas's pain made the cost more real than any legal proceeding could. As Victoria was led from the house, she turned back toward her son with desperate eyes. Thomas, remember that everything I did was for our family, for you. Marcus will never understand what real sacrifice looks like. Even in handcuffs, even facing criminal charges, Victoria continued her manipulation, positioning herself as the victim and Marcus as the destroyer of family bonds. The pattern was so ingrained that Chen doubted prison would change it. The Henderson house fell silent after the police cars departed, leaving Marcus alone with Thomas and the weight of choices that had fractured their family beyond repair. Outside, neighbors gathered on porches and sidewalks, witnessing the public collapse of a family that had seemed stable just days earlier. The investigation would continue. Interviews, evidence analysis, legal proceedings that would expose every detail of Victoria's manipulation to public scrutiny. But the immediate damage was done. Eleanor was gone, Victoria faced years in prison, Thomas had lost both his grandfather and his mother, and Marcus carried the burden of being both the agent of justice and the destroyer of what remained of their family bonds. The Millbrook Gazette's headline dominated the front page Tuesday morning. Local woman arrested for elder abuse. Marcus stared at the newspaper spread across his hotel room desk, his father's obituary from just 4 days earlier, now sharing space with Victoria's mugshot. The stark juxtaposition captured the complete transformation of the Henderson family story, from respected local tragedy to public scandal. His phone had been ringing since 6 a.m. Reporters seeking comment, former colleagues expressing concern, and, most painfully, Thomas calling repeatedly from wherever Child Protective Services had placed him overnight. Marcus hadn't answered any of the calls. What could he say that wouldn't make everything worse? The knock on his hotel room door came at 9:30. Margaret Frost stood in the hallway, her professional composure intact, but her eyes reflecting the strain of navigating a case that had exploded far beyond normal probate proceedings. Margaret! Marcus stepped aside to let her enter. I assume you've seen the newspaper. Half the town has called my office this morning. She settled into the room's single chair, placing her briefcase beside her with practiced efficiency. The district attorney wants to meet with you this afternoon. Victoria's attorney is pushing for a plea agreement, but the evidence is too strong for anything less than significant prison time. Marcus felt the weight of that reality settle deeper into his chest. How long? 3 to 7 years, most likely. Elder abuse with financial exploitation carries serious penalties, especially given the systematic nature of Victoria's actions and the substantial assets involved. Margaret's voice was clinical, but Marcus caught the underlying sadness. The plea hearing is scheduled for next week. What about Thomas? Margaret's expression grew more troubled. That's complicated. Victoria's ex-husband has petitioned for custody, but Thomas is old enough to have input into the decision. He's expressed strong opposition to living with his father. What are his other options? Foster care, temporary guardianship with a relative, or emancipation given his age. The court will prioritize his wishes, but 16-year-olds don't always make decisions based on their long-term best interests. Marcus moved to the window overlooking Main Street, where normal Tuesday morning business continued despite the Henderson family's public implosion. He blames me. He thinks I destroyed his family for money. Did you? Margaret's question was gentle but direct. Marcus turned back to her, considering his motives with the honesty that legal proceedings demanded. I told myself it was about justice, about honoring Dad's true wishes, but I also can't deny feeling anger about Victoria's manipulation, about being cast as the absent son who abandoned his family responsibilities. Complex motivations don't invalidate correct actions, Margaret said. Your father's original will reflected his genuine intentions when he possessed full mental capacity. Victoria's inheritance was obtained through criminal manipulation of a vulnerable adult. The court will restore Eleanor's actual wishes. At what cost? Thomas has lost his grandfather, his mother will be in prison, and I've become the uncle who destroyed his family. How is that justice? Margaret closed her briefcase and stood, her movements carrying the weariness of someone who'd spent 40 years watching families destroy themselves through greed and desperation. Justice isn't always satisfying, Marcus. Sometimes it's just the least wrong option among many bad choices. After Margaret left, Marcus sat alone with the newspaper and his phone, scrolling through increasingly desperate messages from Thomas. The most recent text read, Uncle Marcus, please call me. I don't understand why you're doing this to Mom. She took care of Grandpa when you couldn't be bothered. Now she's in jail, and I have nowhere to go. I thought family was supposed to protect each other. The words cut deeper than any legal proceeding could. Thomas's perspective wasn't wrong. Victoria had provided daily care while Marcus sent checks from Chicago. The teenager couldn't understand the distinction between devoted care and manipulative control, couldn't see how Victoria's sacrifices had transformed into justification for criminal behavior. Marcus finally returned the call at noon, bracing himself for his nephew's anger and pain. Uncle Marcus? Thomas's voice was thick with exhaustion and tears. Why won't you just drop the charges? Mom made mistakes, but she doesn't deserve prison. She loved Grandpa. Thomas, I know this is impossible to understand right now, but your mother didn't just make mistakes. She systematically isolated your grandfather, manipulated his medications, and coerced him into changing his will while he was vulnerable and confused. That's not love, that's abuse. But you weren't here. Thomas's voice cracked with adolescent pain and fury. You don't know what it was like watching Grandpa decline, helping Mom change his sheets when he had accidents, listening to him cry for Grandma in the middle of the night. Mom gave up everything to take care of him while you lived your perfect life in Chicago. The accusation hit its mark because it contained truth. Marcus had built a successful career that required distance from family obligations. He'd sent money instead of time, maintained contact through scheduled phone calls rather than spontaneous visits. His guilt about those choices had made him vulnerable to Victoria's manipulation as well. You're right that I wasn't present the way I should have been, Marcus said carefully. But Thomas, loving someone doesn't give you the right to control them or steal from them. Your grandfather's original will was fair. It reflected his actual wishes when he could think clearly. I don't care about the money. Thomas's voice rose to a shout. I care about my mom being in jail and having nowhere to live, and everyone in town looking at me like I'm the son of a criminal. You could have talked to her, worked something out privately. Instead, you called the police and destroyed everything. Marcus closed his eyes, recognizing the impossible position his choices had created. If I hadn't exposed what Victoria did, other vulnerable people might have been victimized. Elder abuse doesn't stop on its own. It escalates until someone intervenes. So you sacrificed our family to save hypothetical strangers? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus had no good answer because Thomas's perspective wasn't entirely wrong. The decision to involve law enforcement had been about more than protecting future victims. It had been about his own anger, his own need for vindication, his own complex relationship with guilt and family responsibility. I made the best decision I could with terrible options, Marcus said finally. But Thomas, regardless of what happens between me and your mother, you're still family. If you need help, if you need somewhere to stay, I'm here. The line was quiet for a long moment. When Thomas spoke again, his voice was small and lost. I don't want your help. I want my mom back and my grandpa back, and for none of this to have happened. I want to live in the house where I grew up and go to school where people don't whisper about my family. I know, and I'm sorry that my choices made that impossible. After Thomas hung up, Marcus sat in his hotel room staring at Main Street, where the Henderson hardware store remained closed with a handwritten sign in the window. Temporarily closed due to family emergency. The store that had supported 3 generations of his family was now another casualty of the war between justice and loyalty. His laptop chimed with an email from his assistant in Chicago. Multiple clients asking about timeline for your return. Johnson project needs your input by Friday. Hope everything is resolved soon. The corporate world that had defined his adult identity felt like a foreign country now. How could he return to consulting on efficiency improvements and profit optimization when his own family had imploded through his direct actions? How could he advise other people's families when he'd chosen legal justice over preserving what remained of his own? Evening brought another knock on his hotel room door. Rebecca Martinez stood in the hallway holding a covered casserole dish, her face etched with the kind of weary sadness that comes from watching neighbors destroy themselves. I brought you dinner, she said simply. Figured you might not be eating much these days. Marcus accepted the dish gratefully, gesturing for Rebecca to enter. She settled into the chair Margaret had occupied that morning, her presence carrying the comfort of someone who'd known him since childhood. The whole town's talking, she said without preamble. Half think you're a hero for protecting your father, half think you're a monster for destroying Victoria. Most are just sad that a good family came to this. What do you think? Rebecca was quiet for a moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. I think you were in an impossible situation with no good choices. I also think Victoria's actions were wrong, regardless of her motivations or sacrifices. But Marcus, that boy is hurting in ways that might never heal. Whatever satisfaction you get from justice, it comes at the cost of Thomas's childhood and sense of family security. I know, Marcus said quietly, but if I hadn't acted, Victoria would have gotten away with manipulating a vulnerable old man. The original will would have been buried along with Dad's body. And now Victoria's in jail, Thomas is in foster care, and you're alone in a hotel room questioning whether you made the right choice. Rebecca's voice was gentle but uncompromising. Justice has been served, but the cost might have been higher than the crime deserved. As Rebecca prepared to leave, she turned back with the kind of direct honesty that small-town relationships allowed. Your father loved both his children, Marcus. He would be heartbroken to see his family destroyed, even in the name of honoring his wishes. Sometimes being right doesn't make you righteous. Left alone with her words and his casserole, Marcus faced the long evening ahead and the longer future that stretched beyond it. The legal proceedings would continue. Victoria would be sentenced. The estate would be redistributed according to Eleanor's original will, but the family that had created that wealth was gone forever, fractured by choices that had transformed love into manipulation and justice into destruction. Outside his window, Millbrook settled into its evening routine, But the Henderson family story had become a cautionary tale that would echo through the community for years to come, a reminder that sometimes the price of truth is higher than anyone is prepared to pay. The Millbrook County Courthouse had never hosted a case that drew such intense community attention. By 8 a.m. on the morning of Victoria's sentencing hearing, every seat in the small courtroom was occupied, with overflow crowds gathering on the courthouse steps. Marcus sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table, acutely aware of the whispered conversations and speculative glances from townspeople who'd known his family for decades. Victoria entered the courtroom wearing a navy blue dress that managed to convey both dignity and vulnerability, a final performance for an audience that would determine her fate. Her attorney, David Brennan from the county seat, had earned his reputation defending difficult cases, but even his considerable skills couldn't overcome the weight of evidence Marcus's cameras had provided. Thomas sat across the aisle with his court-appointed guardian, his 17-year-old face carrying the hollow expression of someone whose world had collapsed too quickly for proper processing. He'd grown thinner during the 6 weeks since Victoria's arrest, his usual teenage energy replaced by the careful stillness of someone afraid that any movement might cause further damage. Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order with the gravitas appropriate for a case that had shattered one of Millbrook's most established families. At 62, Morrison possessed the kind of judicial temperament that balanced compassion with accountability, qualities that would be essential for navigating the complex dynamics of family betrayal and elder abuse. This court has reviewed the evidence presented by both the prosecution and defense, Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. The surveillance footage provided by the victim's son documents systematic isolation, medication manipulation, and psychological coercion of a vulnerable elderly man over a period of 6 months. Marcus felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom as Judge Morrison referenced his role in providing the evidence. Some faces showed approval, others carried judgment, but all reflected the community's struggle to reconcile their image of the devoted daughter Victoria with the calculated manipulator revealed by the footage. Mrs. Castellanos, Judge Morrison continued, addressing Victoria directly, your attorney has argued that your actions were motivated by genuine care for your father and frustration with your brother's absence. While the court acknowledges the sacrifices you made as your father's primary caregiver, those circumstances do not justify the systematic abuse documented in this case. Victoria maintained her composure, but Marcus caught the slight tremor in her hands as she faced the formal acknowledgement of her crimes. David Brennan had negotiated a plea agreement that avoided a lengthy trial, but the evidence was too damning for anything less than significant prison time. The financial exploitation involved in this case was particularly egregious, Judge Morrison said, reviewing the legal documents spread before her. The defendant manipulated her father's mental vulnerability to obtain a will that left her the entirety of his estate, approximately $400,000 in assets that had been intended for equal distribution between both children. The specific dollar amount caused a stir in the courtroom. For many Millbrook residents, $400,000 represented a life-changing sum that put Victoria's motivations in starker perspective. The teenager who'd become pregnant at 17, the divorced mother struggling with alimony payments, had seen her father's decline as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. Mr. Henderson, Judge Morrison said, turning toward Marcus, would you like to make a victim impact statement? Marcus stood slowly, his prepared remarks suddenly feeling inadequate for the magnitude of what had unfolded. He looked across the courtroom, at Victoria maintaining her dignified facade, at Thomas refusing to meet his eyes, at Rebecca Martinez in the third row with tears streaming down her face. Your Honor, my father was a fair man who loved both his children despite our very different choices about how to live our lives. The will Victoria obtained from him during his most vulnerable months doesn't reflect his actual wishes or values. It reflects her ability to exploit his confusion and dependency. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued. But this case isn't just about money or inheritance. It's about the betrayal of trust between a father and daughter, about the systematic abuse of someone who deserved protection in his final months. My sister's actions didn't just steal from my father. They robbed him of dignity, autonomy, and peace during his last days on earth. He paused, looking directly at Victoria for the first time since entering the courtroom. The tragedy is that Victoria was capable of genuine care. She could have been the daughter our father needed without becoming his manipulator. Instead, her desperation transformed love into exploitation and sacrifice into justification for criminal behavior. Victoria's attorney requested permission for his client to address the court before sentencing. Victoria stood with the poise she'd maintained throughout the proceedings, but her voice carried a tremor that revealed the cost of months spent defending the indefensible. Your Honor, I want to acknowledge the pain my actions have caused my family and this community. I never intended to harm my father. Everything I did came from a place of love and desperation. Watching him decline while managing my own financial struggles created circumstances that led me to make terrible choices. She turned toward Thomas, her voice breaking slightly. Most of all, I'm sorry to my son, who has suffered consequences he never deserved because of decisions I made in moments of desperation and fear. Thomas, you are the best thing I've ever done, and I hope someday you can forgive the mistakes that have cost us both so much. Thomas remained motionless, his young face a mask of controlled emotion that couldn't hide the devastation underneath. The apology he'd been waiting for had finally come, but it arrived too late to prevent the destruction of everything familiar in his world. Judge Morrison reviewed her notes one final time before delivering the sentence that would define the next phase of everyone's lives. Mrs. Castellanos, the court sentences you to 5 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after serving 2/3 of your sentence. You are also ordered to pay full restitution of the fraudulently obtained inheritance, plus court costs and fees. The gavel's sound echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. 5 years. Enough time for Thomas to finish high school and start college. Enough time for the community to process the Henderson family's fall from grace. Enough time for everyone involved to build new lives on the ruins of the old ones. As court officers approached to escort Victoria away, she turned toward Thomas one final time. I love you, sweetheart. Remember that everything I did because I thought it was best for our family. Uncle Marcus will never understand what real sacrifice looks like, but someday you'll be old enough to judge for yourself. Even in her final moments of freedom, Victoria couldn't resist one last manipulation, positioning herself as the misunderstood mother and Marcus as the uncle who destroyed their family for money. The pattern was so ingrained that prison might never break it. Thomas finally looked up as his mother was led away in handcuffs, his 17-year-old face crumpling with the weight of loss and confusion. In the space of 2 months, he'd lost his grandfather to natural death and his mother to criminal conviction, leaving him alone to navigate the adult world with nothing but the competing narratives of love and justice that had torn his family apart. Marcus approached his nephew as the courtroom emptied, but Thomas stepped back instinctively. Don't, the teenager said quietly. Just don't. You got what you wanted. Mom's in prison, and you get Grandpa's money. I hope it was worth destroying everything. The words hit Marcus like physical blows because they contained enough truth to hurt. He had wanted justice, had felt satisfaction when Victoria's manipulation was exposed, had experienced vindication when the original will was restored. But standing in the courthouse hallway watching his nephew walk away with his court-appointed guardian, Marcus questioned whether any of it had been worth the human cost. Rebecca Martinez appeared at his elbow, her face etched with the sadness that had defined the entire proceeding. That boy is going to need time to process what happened here today. Give him space to heal, Marcus. He'll find his way back to family when he's ready. As the courthouse emptied and Millbrook began processing the Henderson family's public conclusion, Marcus stood alone in the hallway where his father's legacy had been legally restored and morally complicated beyond repair. Justice had been served, truth had been acknowledged, and Eleanor's actual wishes would be honored. But the family that had created that legacy was gone forever, scattered by choices that had transformed love into manipulation, desperation into crime, and the search for justice into the destruction of everything 3 generations of Hendersons had built in the heart of a small town that would never quite forget what had happened when good people made terrible choices. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, Marcus found himself standing in the doorway of Henderson Hardware, keys heavy in his hand, as he contemplated reopening the store that had defined 3 generations of his family. The morning sun streamed through dusty windows, illuminating shelves still organized according to Eleanor's precise system. Nuts and bolts arranged by size, paint cans grouped by brand, tools displayed with the care of someone who understood their purpose. Thomas appeared at his shoulder, taller now, and carrying himself with the careful composure of someone who'd aged years in months. At 17, he possessed an adult awareness that childhood should have protected him from longer, but his eyes still held traces of the boy who'd loved his grandfather and trusted his mother without question. "You sure about this?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying the neutral tone he'd adopted since moving in with Marcus the previous month. The transition hadn't been easy. Neither of them knew how to navigate the relationship between uncle and nephew when so much pain lay between them. "Dad always said the hardware store was about more than selling tools," Marcus replied, stepping into the familiar space. "It was about helping neighbors solve problems, about being part of the community's foundation." Thomas moved toward the cash register, running his fingers along the worn wooden counter where Eleanor had tallied purchases for 4 decades. Grandpa would have wanted it to stay open. The simple statement carried weight because it was true. Eleanor Henderson had built his identity around serving Millbrook's practical needs, around being the man people turned to when things broke and needed fixing. Letting the store die would have dishonored his memory more than any family scandal could. "I've been thinking," Marcus said carefully. "When you graduate next year, if you're interested, there might be a place for you here. College is important, but the store needs someone who understands what it meant to your grandfather." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded slightly. "Maybe. We'll see." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was possibility. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.